Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 73 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, and it was day 2 of closing submissions. And we heard 4 different closing submissions today. The day wrapped up a little early, just after 2 p.m. We were supposed to hear 5 closing submissions today, but one, Lisa Banfield's lawyer, was flying from Toronto, and from what I understand from the brief comment made by Commissioner Michael Mcdonald, there must have been some issue with the flight or with the travel arrangements. In any event, that lawyer is going to speak tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So just a note for anybody that's watching along with this, it's not a 9:30 start tomorrow. It's going to be a 9 o'clock start. And you're going to want to, if you're interested in watching, you'll want to start right at 9 o'clock because I'm sure it'll be an interesting presentation from Ms. Banfield's lawyer. Particularly, I'd be interested in a number of things, but one thing is the reaction to what Sandra McCullough said yesterday about how many of the family members were offended by the sort of characterization of James Lockyer, Ms. Banfield's lead lawyer, I'll come to that in a second, of how the family members simply asking to cross-examine or allow Ms. Banfield to be cross-examined was somehow engaging in conspiracy theories and was sort of this U.S.-style conspiracy-minded objectives that they may have had. So Sandra McCullough expressed their offense at that. I'll be curious to see what Ms. Banfield's lawyer has to say, if anything, on that specific point. Interesting, it will not be James Lockyer that's coming to Halifax from Toronto to make submissions on behalf of Ms. Banfield. It's going to be Jessica Zita. Jessica Zita is in Mr. Lockyer's firm. She was called to the Ontario Bar in 2017. Seems to have argued lots of prominent cases and had a good career, though not a particularly long one. But in any event, I wonder what this is on Ms. Banfield's perspective. If it's not worth James Lockyer's time to fly down and make submissions on her behalf. I think it's a sense that Ms. Banfield's team feels that the Mass Casualty Commission isn't the most important forum in which her legal affairs are being handled. The criminal matter was obviously very important, had some important consequences, and the civil claim where she was seeking to retain her portion, whatever that may be, of Gabriel Wortman's estate. So their focus may be elsewhere. But some of the conclusions that are going to come from this commission are going to be important when it comes to arguing that civil claim. So I'll be interested to hear those arguments tomorrow morning. Today, we heard from Tom Mcdonald on behalf of Scott MacLeod, Jane Lenahan on behalf of Gina Goulet, Linda Huffman and Steve Topshe on behalf of the Oliver Tuck family, and then Jamie Goodwin on behalf of the Women's Shelter, Transition House, Nova Scotia, and Be the Peace Institute, Women's Shelters Canada. First thing, though, before any of that got started, Jamie Van Wart, one of the Mass Casualty Commission lawyers, get up to the podium and announced or advised the commissioners that they wish to have some documents marked as exhibits. And this happens fairly often. They'll get up and there'll be some housekeeping things to take care of, documents that have been received, and they're going to be entered into evidence. Well, there was 513 documents tendered as evidence this morning. None of those are posted yet to the commission website, so we don't know what they are. One that caught my eye was something about, it seems like the commission's efforts to determine anything where Wortman may have been connected to the police as an informant, as an agent. Whatever investigation they've done seems to have been captured in a document, and that document has now been tendered into evidence. You won't find it on the commission website as of yet. We'll keep an eye out for that. So a critical theory, at least, or a prevalent theory, and would have thought that the commission would have dealt with this a little more head-on at some point, but they haven't. So we'll wait to see what those documents involve. Now, What Jamie Van Wart did also say was that these documents have already been provided to the participants, and so they all have copies of that. So presumably, if there was anything earth-shattering in these documents, we would be hearing about that through the Participants Council or some of the participants themselves. So we'll see what that comes to. So Tom McDonald was first. Tom McDonald was one of the lawyers in the Desmond inquiry, so I got to know him down there. He was representing the Borden family, which were the in-laws of Lionel Desmond. And in this, he was representing Scott MacLeod, brother to Sean MacLeod, murdered in the morning of April 19th, 2020. Now, Tom McDonald, he gave some sort of broad thoughts on policing, talked about reimagining rural policing. He talked about lack of air support planning, that there should be more clarity when it comes to critical incident and the command structure involved in that suggests. Now, here's an issue. So, watching to see, broadly what people are recommending. And with respect to the RCMP, Tom McDonald talked about this implementation committee idea, and this was something that Tara Miller mentioned yesterday, or took some time to go through yesterday. And Tom McDonald was talking about who should be part of that. The federal and provincial governments mentioned the RCMP as part of the implementation committee as well. And I just note that because that implies, of course, that the RCMP will continue to be the policing entity for Nova Scotia under those recommendations, and so he's not recommending that the RCMP be replaced. Now, in representing Scott MacLeod, Mr. McDonald also says he, on behalf of Mr. MacLeod, feels that he's been heard throughout this process, and so wanted to convey that to the commissioners. So that was Tom McDonald on behalf of Scott MacLeod. Next was Jane Lenahan, who represents Gina Goulet's estate. She listed many of the issues that we've heard already from the RCMP response right in Portapique. She also expressed gratitude to the commission for their what she described as a thorough investigation. Actually, she got a little emotional when she was expressing that gratitude on behalf of the Goulet family, which always a little, a little curious or whatever. When she wasn't the only one today. There was another lawyer that I'll come to in a minute, Jamie Goodwin, that also got a little emotional during his presentation. And I always say about lawyers, you have to be able to appreciate the significance of emotions in others, recognize them, be aware of their significance and their power, but not be susceptible to them yourself. You need to keep a level head, calm and clear, free of any undue emotional influences as you're making your presentation. I think it affects not only the quality of your thinking in your presentation, but also the way it's perceived. If you get emotional on a certain point, well, it tends to, I think, detract from the perceived logic of your points. So I just mentioned that. Now, Ms. Lenahan also expressed, I think, a really good point, that her concern remains that the police still think that the public would overreact to an emergency alert. We've heard some of that testimony from the police, and they still seem to maintain that kind of attitude towards the public, a mistrust, really, of the public. Ms. Lenahan also talked about Sergeant O'Brien consuming of alcohol, supported the point made by Josh Bryson yesterday that it was really preposterous to imagine that that's okay, and that the other RCMP officers who were asked questions about it, didn't really seem to want to go there, or else said, yeah, they agreed that it was okay as well. So that was Jane Lenahan representing Gina Goulet. Next, Steve Topshe and Linda Huffman from Birchall's. They were representing the Oliver Tuck family. They split their time. Steve Topshe reviewed the cross-Canada critiques of the RCMP, which are now taking place, including in British Columbia, where there's a review recommending a replacement of the RCMP and the formation of a provincial police force. Local reviews taking place in Colchester County, where finances were an issue and coverage was an issue. He stopped really just short of recommending to the Commission that the RCMP be replaced as the policing entity in Nova Scotia, but certainly the thrust of his comments was in that vein. Linda Huffman, she suggested that there should be that the RCMP should put together a national mass casualty response team. So if one of these incidents happens anywhere in the country, that there's procedure in place, people that are trained and prepared to deal with, just the volume of evidence, the volume of potential scenes, the volume of, families that need to be informed of what's going on. So an increased family liaison presence. She notes that in the Oliver Tuck family, and we heard from Tara Long yesterday, but Miss Huffman, is talking about the other part of the Oliver Tuck family, lived out west, took 5 or 6 hours of calling different people to try to find out what was taking place there. And so that was a long wait, of course, for them under those circumstances. So talked about, tightening up that kind of part of the process and how that can have a real negative effect on families. Now, so that was the end of the presentations by the lawyers representing family members and affected family members. And I just noticed really none of them mentioned domestic violence or really pursued that as a topic. So that's certainly notable in itself. We've all heard the evidence and the experts, but the family members focused their attention on the RCMP response and kept it to the main point, I guess, if I put it that way. Now, next, after Steve Topshe and Linda Huffman, was Jamie Goodwin. Jamie, I didn't know Jamie Goodwin with Hicks, Lemoyne, and Amherst, junior lawyer, 2 years in, called to the bar in 2020. Did a fairly good job for being new at this. Kind of an unfair position to put somebody in just 2 years into the bar. Also a really interesting choice. Controversial in a sense. I was surprised to see that Jamie Goodwin was a male lawyer, speaking for Women's Shelter Canada, Transition House Nova Scotia, and Be the Peace Institute. Representation is supposed to matter, and I would have expected that the lawyer for these, organizations that are dedicated to the eradication of violence against women, gender-based violence, would have had a female lawyer. But that's, I'd be curious if anybody else made that observation. Now, one of the main points that Mr. Goodwin was making was something that we've heard from, was his coercive control. Coercive control is sort of non-violent but controlling behavior on the part of a man in the relationship, controlling finances, controlling the woman's time, who she spends time with, who her friends would be, many other sort of coercive control. I mean, just what the words say, and a recommendation to criminalize that, as some other jurisdictions are either doing or not doing. Now, he didn't really flesh out that idea very much. We did hear this a few weeks ago in expert witnesses, and it seemed to me the thrust of the conversation was against criminalizing coercive control, that it was using a blunt instrument of the criminal justice system to combat something that really needs a more thorough, educationally focused sort of response. But it is being studied at some level, it seems, and so we'll see if that goes anywhere, or if the commission, in fact, takes that idea and runs with it. What I was really waiting for was, because of course domestic violence has been a major topic in the Mass Casualty Commission, what I'm waiting to hear is somebody to come out with, here's something that'll probably work, and it's a major change, but it'll make a difference. We see in the Marshall inquiry that there was a major structural change to how prosecutions are done in Nova Scotia, and you don't change the culture overnight, but if you change the rules and disclosure rules and the attitude of crowns, well, over time, and maybe not a whole lot of time, the culture and the system changes. So, what is the idea in the domestic violence realm that's going to be the equivalent of that? So it'll be interesting to see. We didn't hear it today. I don't think coercive control criminalization is that idea. The other thing I was waiting to hear today was a real attempt to build a case, a thorough case dealing with the specific facts that we've heard throughout this commission, that this series of killings by this killer was either motivated, caused, or that the central character of them was gender-based violence. We didn't hear that today. It was sort of almost presumed at the beginning of Mr. Goodwin's presentation, but not developed. And I think we need to hear that developed in a little more thorough manner. Now, we may hear that tomorrow. Now, tomorrow, in addition to Jessica Zita on behalf of Ms. Banfield, we're going to hear from the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, which is called LEAF, and the Avalon Sexual Assault Center. That's a combined representation. We'll hear from a lawyer for the Elizabeth Fry Society of Mainland Nova Scotia, feminists fighting femicide. So hopefully in that group of presentations, we'll hear these ideas or these theories at least fleshed out a little more. We'll hear from the RCMP Veterans Association of Nova Scotia. We'll hear from the Truro Police, the Canadian Firearms Association, and the Canadian Coalition for Gun Control. And then on the final day, we're going to hear from the BC Civil Liberties Association, Department of Justice Nova Scotia, who have evidently been at the inquiry. Haven't heard from them much at all. I don't know if they've asked a question. Sort of reminds me of the Desmond inquiry where they were there. Actually, they had two lawyers there the whole time and barely spoke. And then the Federal Department of Justice, I expect, will have a strong presentation to make on Friday as well. That'll be the closing. Again, mentioned that the Mass Casualty Commission lawyers themselves will not be making a presentation, contrary to what we've seen in other inquiries in Nova Scotia, right to the Marshall inquiry, where Commission Counsel made a long presentation and submitted written submissions as well. So be interested to hear if there's an explanation about that, but there hasn't been yet. So we'll wait to hear what happens tomorrow morning. It'll be interesting to get going early at 9 o'clock and hear what Ms. Banfield's lawyer has to say. So far, we haven't heard much. We've heard little snippet comments from James Lockyer, a couple of questions about who was involved in the decision to charge her criminally in the first place, and that's been about it. So I'll be interested to hear if there's a longer thought-out sort of narrative from her perspective of what's going on in the commission, how she's been treated, and what she thinks should happen next. So until then, thank you for watching, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.